Hello everyone, and welcome to the second audio edition of my UFC full card betting preview. I go by the name of Sideswipe, and I've been posting written breakdowns of all the betting lines for every UFC event this year over on Reddit. I recently branched out and provided an audio podcast version for UFC 295 on YouTube, and as I really enjoyed the process, I'm back again for another week. As much as I don't really like it when other content creators do these long-winded recaps, I'd be doing myself a disservice if I didn't briefly go through the card, my bets, my breakdowns, my opinions. So we're briefly going to review UFC 295, but I promise I will make it quick. The timestamps are in the description box below if you do want to whiz past this. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea. All you really need to know is I killed it. I had 7.58 units of profit with a return on investment of 39%. My parlay of the week was a fourfold that was paying around plus 450, and that was a winner. And my dog of the week was Diego Lopez. That was also a winner. I suppose now is as good a time as any for me to remind you that at the top of all of my Reddit posts is a link to buymeacoffee.com, which is a website where you can tip me in increments of $5 for the content that I create. Obviously, every single post that I've put out on Reddit this year has been done for free. I'm not a professional gambler. I have a full-time job myself. I kind of do this because I enjoy the hobby side of it, but also because I do have a real passion for trying to help the MMA betting community better understand the game of gambling and make some good decisions along the way so that we can all make money together. But yeah, if you were feeling really generous and wanted to give me some money to say thank you for the work that I do, I would absolutely appreciate it. But really, the thing I appreciate most is likes and comments and engagement to the work that I do. It's lovely to see that people are reading it and engaging with it. So thank you very much for everyone who does that on a weekly basis. So starting off with the main event for UFC 295, I won 1.5 units on Alex Pereira. As I expected, he handled that limited grappling ability of Aguirre really well, and he showed himself to be the more technical and composed striker. The leg kicks were really the story of the fight up until the knockout. I did think that the stoppage itself was a little bit early, but Alex would have just landed more ground strikes from that position, so really I don't think it would have changed the fight had Goddard let it go on a minute or two longer. Before that, I won 3.18 units on Tom Aspinall's money line and inside the distance, whilst losing a little bit on the submission prop. I'm so happy for Tom. I said in my breakdown for that fight that he is one of the good guys in the UK, and if you're a UK fan of the sport, you're a UK fan of Tom. It's a shame we didn't get to see him use his wrestling, because I know that was the big discussion throughout that week, but in all honesty, the fact that he beat Pavlovich at his own game really does highlight that my mathematical opinion on the fight was the right call, and that Tom did have him covered across all of the realms, so therefore should not have been a minus 110 price as I predicted. Really happy with that. Nice to sort of take a more objective approach as opposed to sort of betting with my heart, especially on a fight that's got a UK guy fighting for a title. It's not very often that we get those. Before that fight on the main card, I preached caution in trusting Mackenzie Dern at the price tag that she was, simply because historically she's been really untrustworthy and her wrestling and boxing are nowhere near as good as her grappling. She did exactly what she always does. She shat the bed as a big favourite. That's always going to hold her back. She cannot be trusted to hit the top 5. She never will. She's going to make these mistakes over and over again, and I hope that some people dodged a bullet based off my advice in that one, because I know I certainly did. Before that, I lost 2 units on Matt Favola, but honestly, I don't really hate my read on the fight. He was looking competent with the anti-wrestling, and he was making St. Denis work for the very brief moments that we did see in that fight. He wasn't winning the fight, so I understand why he was the underdog. I'm just disappointed in the way that the fight ended, because obviously from where we were seeing the fight, that head kick, it wasn't quick, it was very obviously there. It's a shame Matt wasn't defensively aware on the exit from the clinch there. So he paid the price for not doing his due diligence. It's a bit of a shame, but I would have liked to see that fight play out, because I still do believe that Favola would have been able to fight like he was showing for 15 whole minutes, and he could have made that fight competitive in the later half. Diego Lopez fight opened the main card, and that was one I was so happy with. I think I broke that fight down absolutely perfectly. I won 4.55 units across his money line and the KO prop. Sabatini just wasn't anywhere near urgent enough in getting his grappling going, and I do think that was because he respected the threatening guard of Lopez. And as I said in the breakdown, the more time that Lopez gets on the feet, the more dangerous it's going to be for Sabatini. Took him about a minute, probably less than that. Really happy for Diego Lopez. He absolutely deserves it. So the prelim headliner was Steve Erceg. He looked great value to me at the minus 137 that I bet him at. Obviously, he swelled up to minus 200 by fight night. I don't think he looked minus 200, but I think he looked value for the number I had him at. As I said, I expected his volume to be far superior to Costa, who is very low volume and very low kick heavy. Costa's power did have more of an effect than I was expecting, but I said Erceg was very durable and could withstand it, and he absolutely did. Really happy with the fight IQ that he showed in that third round to just lock the fight down and win the decision, so that was a great one to watch. Earlier on in the prelims, I said Lupi Godinez versus Ricci would be a very close fight to call, and it ended up in a split decision. I didn't think it was that close. I did think that Godinez quite clearly won the fight, but at the end of the day, the judges are the ones who decide what the result is. I had 3 units on that fight going the distance in a parlay with Brendan Allen. Obviously, we're going to get to that in a bit more detail later, but happy to be going into this card already on the right foot. Earlier on, I lost 2 units on Jared Gordon winning a decision. He scored his first UFC KO since 2017, so I didn't really have that on my bingo card. I won a unit back in a parlay on his money line with Mateusz Figlak from Cage Warriors, who mauled his opponent in a pretty decent win. And finally, on the first fight of the night, I lost 2 units on Dennis Bazooka. I could sit here and say that the fight only lasted a minute, so it's a shame that Bazooka never really got going, but Embers was winning every second of that fight. I think that was a pretty shit bet on my part. It shouldn't have been 2 units. I think I might have said on the podcast I might have overstaked, and I did. So, still a work in progress, still learning on the job. And with that out of the way, we've still got 4 UFC events left in 2023. So without further ado, let's just move on to the upcoming card. We're back at the Apex for UFC Vegas 82. UFC Vegas 82 may not have a star-studded lineup, but I genuinely think it's one of my favourite cards of the year. The matchmakers were on absolute fire when they put this card together. None of the fights are going to blow your hair back in terms of like name value and like ticket selling ability, but stylistically, just some of the 2 guys they've put together, it's just strokes of genius across the entire card. Like either from like a business perspective or from a fan-friendly perspective. Honestly, just feel like it's worth saying, like, round of applause to Sean Shelby and Mick Maynard, because they've absolutely killed it on this card. And our main event of the evening for UFC Vegas 82 immediately proves my point, as Brendan Allen faces Paul Craig in the middleweight division. These are 2 of the best Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys in the UFC, and whilst this may not be a super exciting fight for like title implications right now, I think it is one of the most exciting fights you could possibly put together in this division. It's fascinating, it's going to be exciting, it's going to have a whole lot of different things, and there's going to be so much finishing ability from start to finish that I just think it's pretty crazy. Paul Craig is a very chaotic fighter. His ceiling is never too high, but his floor is never too low, if that makes sense, because his guard is so dangerous that any fighter that wants to try and finish him is going to have to step into the danger zone to actually get what they want. Look at that win over Nikita Krylov. He lost about 99% of that fight, but the 1% that he did win, he got the finish and won the fight. So Paul Craig's never out of it, and it just makes him a fascinating fighter to watch. I've always thought that Paul Craig was one-dimensional. That's always the label I've given him, and I've always thought that's made him an easy fighter to analyse. But he basically told me to go fuck myself in the Andre Muniz win, which was quite funny looking back on. It was honestly a sensational performance from Craig. He hustled hard. He forced Andre Muniz to sort of panic wrestle and overexert himself, and then he turned the tide and put on a beating on him on the mat, which was just honestly a sight to behold. As a UK guy, I think Paul Craig is an absolute legend in MMA. I think he's one of the most must-see fighters in the entire sport, and yeah, I hope that he sticks around for a very long time because I just love watching him fight. So over to Brendan Allen. Brendan Allen is one of those fighters that, despite feeling like he's been in the sport for ages, he's only 27 years old and he's still improving, which is insane. I remember watching an LFA fight of his in 2018 when he fought Fluffy Hernandez. In that fight, he did end up losing, but it was like a 25-minute grappling affair. And whilst Fluffy Hernandez was a bit older, a bit more developed, and just a bit more physically imposing, I remember thinking, shit, this Brendan Allen kid, if he carries on, he's going to be in the UFC. He's going to have top 15 potential. He's just got such good grappling. He just needs to put it all together. And he has been putting it all together, not just in that grappling round, but also the striking. But the grappling also has improved in that time. I mean, it's absolutely insane that he has a submission victory over Kevin Holland. Kevin Holland is not an easy man to submit. I know we've seen a little bit more of his like negative grappling, and that's the narrative surrounding Kevin Holland, but his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is pretty good. And a lot of fighters that have had grappling success against him in recent years have sort of just laid and prayed with a bit of ground striking in a safe position. I do rate Kevin Holland as a grappler, and I think that having a submission win over him that Brendan Allen does is genuinely one of the best things on his resume at the moment. So yeah, his striking also is kind of something that has to be mentioned, especially in this fight. He's really tightened it up. Early in his UFC career, obviously, he suffered those knockout losses to Chris Curtis and Sean Strickland, the latter specifically not being a very good look simply because Sean Strickland is quite pillar-fisted. I don't mean to chat shit on our middleweight champion, but it is true. He himself admits he's got no power in his hands, so to get knocked out by him like Brendan Allen did was pretty embarrassing. But yeah, along the way, in the last few years, he's had the performance against Punahele Soriano, where his boxing looked incredibly tightened and really impressive. And then also most recently against Bruno Silva, where that fight was basically being marketed as a striker versus grappler affair. But Brendan Allen looked like the striker as well as the grappler, and honestly just had his Brazilian opponent covered. And the same Brazilian opponent who went 15 minutes with Alex Pereira and, didn't really disgrace himself too much in that fight. So for Bruno Silva to get absolutely like pulverized by Brendan Allen was a really interesting sight. So looping back to the fight at hand, I think that Paul Craig is in for a tough fight here, simply because Brendan Allen's striking improvements mean that he's going to be a threat pretty much everywhere. All fights start standing, and Brendan Allen is going to be the one who's going to be able to dictate where the fight takes place. And if he was smart, he would choose to just stand and trade with Craig, because that is a pretty one-sided fight, in my opinion. If Craig does try and force the fight to the mat, Allen shouldn't, but probably will still engage him. But I also think that Allen is the better scrambler, the better wrestler, and overall the better positional grappler. So I would expect Allen to find his way to a dominant position more often than not, which obviously makes him look good on the scorecards. But also he has the savvy to try and move himself out of Craig's guard, sit in half guard, sit in side controls, find them out, and obviously just keep himself safe from the very limited weapons that Paul Craig brings to the table. Limited is still the right word. I'm not saying they're not dangerous. They obviously are incredibly dangerous. But I think that Brendan Allen has kind of demonstrated that he has what it takes to be able to survive a high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy for 15 minutes on the mat. He showed it against Andre Muniz. I know Craig showed the same against Andre Muniz, but there's a difference between being tired and not being tired, and I think that Brendan Allen has the cardio to also keep this fight in the sort of trajectory that it's supposed to be, and for him not to fall off a cliff and let Craig take advantage of that. So yeah, I think that for that reason, the money line is not quite where it should be. I think he should probably be minus 350, minus 400 in this spot, because Paul Craig is a very limited fighter who has a very narrow path to victory in the wider scheme of an MMA fight. But he's fighting a guy who is prepped to defend that. You know, in previous fights against like the likes of Volkan Oezdemir or Nikita Krylov, those are spots where you could very easily see Craig getting that submission, because the guys that he's fought have historically been quite weak and susceptible to those kind of submissions. Brendan Allen very much isn't. I know Andre Muniz wasn't, and Andre Muniz didn't actually get finished in the way that people were kind of expecting Paul Craig to do so, but that was because he gassed out. I don't think Brendan Allen gasses out here. So for that reason, I think that the window for Paul Craig to hit a guard submission or get a finish that he needs is probably quite low percentage, and for that reason, I think 80% probability is about right for Brendan Allen. Therefore, I took him in a parlay. I placed it midway through UFC 295 fight week, and I combined it with Lupe Godinez versus Tabitha Ricci fight to last over 2.5 rounds. At the time of recording this, that event hasn't actually happened yet, so this could turn out to be a losing bet, which would be pretty awkward. I might just cut this bit out of the audio, we'll see. But if not, I will therefore have just one leg remaining in that double. The price was at minus 137, which is 1.73 if you use decimal odds, just under evens. So I had that for 3 units, and I feel quite confident about it. I think Brendan Allen wins this fight. I think that whilst I love Paul Craig and all of the things that he's done for like British MMA in the last few years, I do think that he really will have met his match on this occasion. So we'll see. Also, just as a final point, I am also interested to see what the price is going to be on Brendan Allen to win by KO. For all the reasons that I just mentioned, I think that Brendan Allen has a real superiority on the feet and could really find that knockout blow if he gets the opportunity. I know it sounds silly to say and it doesn't make sense from a betting perspective, but he really is due a knockout, especially in that Bruno Silva fight. That fight was essentially a knockout win. He just club and subbed his way to the submission win. Obviously, that is something to be careful of, but you'd think that if Brendan Allen wants to find a finish and has a moment to capitalise on a hurt Paul Craig, he would realise that continuing to throw strikes would be in his best interest and not fish for a submission against a guy who is high level at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, especially when you consider that Paul Craig's been finished so many times. I'll be keeping an eye out to see what that price is. I don't really know what price I'm expecting, but if I see something that's like plus 400 or higher, I might be interested in a little sprinkle on it, just because I know that Brendan Allen is such a submission-focused guy that the books are probably going to lean quite heavily in that direction, but Paul Craig is susceptible to strikes, and Brendan Allen has a huge advantage on the feet, I think. In your co-main event of the evening, we have Jake Matthews versus Michael Morales, and whilst this isn't the most exciting fight on paper, I do think it's once again a good example of UFC matchmaking, because Jake Matthews is finally being used for his true purpose. He's been one of the most bizarre cases of career management in the UFC. So for years, they've literally been grooming him like he's some sort of Australasian super prospect. I know he came into the UFC when he was really young, and he showed promise in a time where the only other people that were representing the land down under were Mark Hunt and George Soteropoulos, who were very limited and not very good. But since then, you know, Robert Whittaker, Alex Volkanovski, Adesanya, Cara France, Hooker, even Tuivasa have all come through the ranks, but they still feed Jake Matthews these winnable fights like he's actually going to amount to something one day. He's had 18 UFC appearances, and his last 3 fights were against Darius Flowers, who I don't have his record in front of me, but I'm pretty certain he's either fought once or twice in the UFC, and I don't think he's won any of them. Matthew Semmelsberger, who is a fun fighter, but he is quite limited and quite flawed, and you really should be beating him if you're UFC level. And Andre Fialho, who I think has since been cut, who also is fun, but also flawed. Honestly, if you look over Jake Matthews' last 18 UFC fights, his best wins are Li Jingliang and a 38-year-old Diego Sanchez. A 38-year-old Diego Sanchez that he didn't even finish. It's an awful record, and it really is a lot of Dana White privilege. But the thing is, it does seem like the UFC are actually starting to see sense and realise that they need to cash out of the Jake Matthews experiment. They tried to do that when they put him against Sean Brady, and that obviously worked out very well. They helped push Sean Brady into a top 15 position by giving him a quote-unquote name. They're doing the same thing here with Michael Morales, I think. This is a spot for Michael Morales to catapult himself into the welterweight top 15. Morales has looked like a sensational striker so far. He's beaten Max Griffin and Trevin Giles in his last 2 appearances, who are, on their good days, really good strikers for the outside the rankings fighters. I genuinely think that those 2 names are probably as good, if not better, than anything Jake Matthews has done in his career. I mean, I know Li Jingliang's got name value, but really, is he any better than Max Griffin? I think he's probably on the same level, in my opinion. I know that's a very wiki-capping approach to kind of look at both of their records and say this guy has a better record than this guy or whatever, but I just think that Michael Morales has already demonstrated that he has the tools to be able to deal with the same kind of level as Jake Matthews. Jake Matthews probably hits as hard as Max Griffin, and Max Griffin wasn't really able to trouble Michael Morales, and he used good evasion in that fight, and he was pretty defensively sound. He's not an overall better striker than him or Trevin Giles. Trevin Giles on a good day, I know Trevin Giles on a bad day is a completely different thing. And yeah, Jake Matthews is definitely more diverse than those 2 fighters, but he's not a beast wrestler. He's a better wrestler than Adam Fuggett, but Adam Fuggett didn't really have any success over Michael Morales at all in the grappling realms. So I think that from what we saw of Morales there's enough to be confident in the fact that he should be able to handle this medium step up in wrestling credentials that Jake Matthews has. Also, Jake Matthews has no finishing ability on the mat. He is not particularly threatening. He's very much position over submission or even position over ground strikes. And when you consider that Morales is going to have a striking advantage and is a lot more flashy than him, it's going to take a lot for Jake Matthews to do work on the mat to actually swing rounds back in his favour. And I just don't think he has the style to do that. In a way, I think that Jake Matthews' like wrestling style is very outdated, and it doesn't lean into that damage narrative at all in the UFC these days, and I think that he's going to have to do a lot more with it. We saw in the fights against Diego Sanchez and also Emil Meek, he just had top position for so much time but did very little with it to actually sort of try and finish the fight. It seemed more like he was sort of just happy to lock it up, shut it down and win on the scorecards. And if Michael Morales can do enough in those moments where that's not the position, I think he wins anyway, regardless of how much success Jake Matthews has with the grappling. And I don't even think he's going to have that much. So looking at the betting line for this fight, you've got minus 250 on Michael Morales. And I genuinely think the only reason that it's not up in the minus 300s and 400s is because Jake Matthews feels like a higher level fighter than he is. He's an 18-fight UFC veteran, and that commands some respect simply because, you know, most fighters these days don't last more than like 5 fights in the UFC. They show that they can't swim and they therefore just get drowned. But 18 fights, especially over the last like almost decade, is quite impressive. But it goes back to what I was originally saying. Scroll through Jake Matthews' Wikipedia page and look at his record and tell me that he has had the same level of opposition in those 18 fights and is therefore fair to be viewed in the same trajectory as those fighters who haven't made it. He simply has been gifted quite a lot of gimme fights whenever his record has been like looking into the negatives. And for that reason, yeah, I just simply think that Michael Morales is on the up and Jake Matthews is on the downwards trend. Jake Matthews doesn't win this fight, in my opinion. I think Michael Morales does. I think Michael Morales wins it quite confidently. In my opinion, minus 250 is not enough of a price tag. And minus 250 is usually where I draw the line in terms of being able to bet a money line that I'm very confident in. So I have 5 units on Michael Morales to win at minus 250. It's as simple as that. I think this line inflates between now and fight day. I got in on it early. As I said, I'm recording this before UFC 295 has taken place. So I would expect this to hit minus 300 at least by fight day, which gives me, you know, nice closing line value on the bet. And I just think that Michael Morales styles on him and continues his ascent up the top 15. Next up, we have Jordan Leavitt versus Chase Hooper. And you might be able to hear that I'm already laughing just because I think this is a hilarious fight. Now, I know it's the narrative that I've spoken about quite a few times, but once again, I think this is just genius matchmaking. Both guys are obviously incredibly one-dimensional and incredibly limited, and there are certain fights that you could put them in where it's just a car crash and it all looks awful. But I think that this is just clever, where you're appealing to both guys' superior skill sets and actually giving them an opportunity to showcase what they can do well and against each other. They're also quite well-known names for the prelims, if that makes sense. I know that neither is particularly successful in the UFC, but we all know who they are. Jordan Leavitt is an incredibly polarizing figure with a lot of his antics, and also fought Paddy Pimblett recently. And Chase Hooper is, that scrawny kid that has a real presence on social media. Personally, I can't stand the stuff that he tweets on social media, but that's just me. I am a big fan of Jordan Leavitt, though. I think the way that he pisses off the UFC fan base is absolutely hilarious. So more power to him, and I hope he keeps doing it. Yeah, to me, this is basically like a heavily discounted version of the main event, where you've got two grapplers who are just like a mess facing each other, whereas you could say that the grapplers in the main event are actually high level at what they do, whereas this is just like the main event from Wish. As I say, two one-dimensional fighters who are both grapplers, and usually that actually leans itself to a really great betting narrative, because one-dimensional fighters are like the gift, because it's very easy to analyze a fight for them against an opponent. You simply look at how their opponent handles what they bring to the table, and does the opponent excel where they're shit, and if so, you've probably got a bet. Unfortunately, that doesn't apply to fights where the two one-dimensional guys with the same skill set are facing each other, because most of the time they just sort of cancel each other out. And to me, this is one of those times, so I didn't really look into it with a whole lot of analytical detail. Neither of them can strike well at all, despite the fact that their last fights actually showed a lot of good highlights in the striking realm. I think that was obviously more down to the opponents that they were fighting. But at least on the feet, Hooper is more enthusiastic and durable. He has a lot more volume and a lot more of a enthusiasm to go forward, despite the fact that he gets hit a lot. So really, it'll kind of be like power versus volume, because I do think that Leavitt is probably the harder hitter of the two. You can analyze the striking all you want, but I think that this is, at this level, these two are going to be happy for it to just tangle on the mat. And from there, I think I do favour Hooper as well, simply because he's got that bigger frame, and he's also probably the better wrestler of the two and will find top position more often. So regardless of whether or not you find a submission, I think Chase Hooper's probably going to find himself in the dominant position more often, and will also have the better visuals in the striking department. So yeah, I can understand why Chase Hooper is a favourite here. I can't even remember what his price is, because I did not look into this fight for more than 30 seconds from a betting perspective. I don't think I'd have any interest in betting on Jordan Leavitt in a spot like this, because he's not facing someone who is susceptible to the one thing he does well, whereas Chase Hooper is not a complete martial artist and really isn't that much of a martial artist in my opinion. So I don't see why you would want to bet on this fight. These are guys who are quite bettable, but not in a fight like this. So just wait and then see who they get booked against next, and hopefully it's a striker, and then you can figure out whether or not you want to get involved in that fight. But it's an opportunity to learn, it's an opportunity to pass, it's not an opportunity to bet. So I'd just leave it alone if I were you. Next up, we have the debut of Payton Talbott versus Nick Aguirre. I can't remember how to pronounce that guy's surname, but I'm just going to go with Aguirre. For those of you who follow my stuff on Reddit, you may remember that I bet on Payton Talbott for his Dana White's Contender Series debut. I really like what I saw from him on the regional scene, which obviously we all know by now that I'm not really keen on diving into the regional scene a whole lot, because I think you take everything that you conclude with a pinch of salt. But I also knew in that fight that Reyes Cortez was not UFC quality and was not at the level required to win that fight. So combining that with my positive views of what I saw from Talbott, it just seemed like a clear bet to me. But it has to be said that that bet was made at least 50% with the knowledge that I wanted to fade Reyes Cortez as opposed to wanting to bet on Payton Talbott. So don't go thinking that I think he's the best thing since sliced bread, because I don't think we know anything about Payton Talbott basically at this level. He has his fight against Nick Aguirre, who has only had one fight in the UFC so far, where he got soundly outgrappled by Dan Argueta. So much so that, honestly, that 15 minutes worth of footage is kind of redundant, because we didn't see a whole lot of the things that Nick Aguirre actually brings to the table, apart from getting ragdolled. He did have some moments of striking. It wasn't particularly impressive. He didn't look very quick. His striking combinations are pretty basic. I just generally wasn't impressed with what I saw from him on the feet. And from what I do know of Talbott, I would very much expect Talbott to have a big striking advantage on this one. Looking further back through Aguirre's record, before that Dana White Contender Series fight, all he's done is crush cans. Round one finishes against guys who have barely any experiences and barely any wins. You can take absolutely nothing from that, and therefore I think it kind of stops this fight from being one that you can have enough confidence in to put your money on, despite the very strong betting line. Payton Talbott currently sits at minus 600, and I think the way that that can easily be explained is that Talbott has the promotional hype train behind him. He's come from the Prospect Feeder show. They're going to have so many sound bites and highlight reels and talking about why this man is the next John Jones or whatever the fuck they want to call him. But Nick Aguirre on the reverse has already lost a UFC fight to a guy who has since gone on to lose a UFC fight. So just simply going off MMA maths, Aguirre's ceiling is not far off the UFC floor, whereas we don't know where Payton Talbott's ceiling is, but the sky's the limit kind of thing is what they'll tell you. So no one's going to want to bet Nick Aguirre here, and for that reason, the bookies can put the price of whatever they want on Payton Talbott because they know that the people who don't care about the price will pay it, and the people who are caring about the price just won't bet on the fight. So yeah, I think minus 600 is a ridiculous price tag for a debutant. You have to remember that anything can happen in MMA. If you've been watching the sport as long as I have, you won't be surprised by anything because you've seen ridiculous shit happen and favourites completely like shit the bed and just drop the ball. And I wouldn't be surprised if someone who is not battle tested like Payton Talbott, who is going to feel the pressure of a UFC debut, I wouldn't be surprised if he did something that made him look like he wasn't a minus 600 favourite. And even if he does, if you put minus 600 in your parlay, you're not even going to get the price of your parlay enhanced by much by multiplying it by 1.16. So don't bother is basically what I'm saying. There is no point in you adding risk to your bet for Payton Talbott when he's not even going to give you a whole lot of returns for it. So just pass. Don't risk it. Leave it alone. I'm not saying Payton Talbott doesn't win. He probably steamrolls the guy, but it's not worth getting involved from a betting perspective. Next up, we have a fight in the women's division, the higher of two on this card, and that is between Amanda Ribas and Luana Pinheiro. I feel like I'm going to say it every single week, but I'm a big fan of women's MMA. I'm a big fan of betting on women's MMA. I hate the narrative that betting on women's MMA is something you shouldn't do, because I think it can be a really profitable thing. It's been profitable for me. I think it's easier to read than men's a lot of the time. And Amanda Ribas is a woman I'm very familiar with in terms of betting on her and analysing her fights. She's one of my girls. She's been one of my money trains over the years. Second only probably to Karolina Kowalkiewicz in the last few years, but I'm big fans of both women. Big fan of Amanda Ribas. Her personality is like really funny and really like enjoyable. She's really energetic, and I really like that, along with the fact that I think she's a really talented fighter that has top 5 ability, I think, in the division on paper. She rarely gets outclassed by anybody. Her jiu-jitsu is really good. Her striking is decent enough, and yeah, she's just a tricky fighter to beat, I think. But there is a way to beat her, and Maycee Barber showed it in the last one. Her chin is, at this point, dust. I genuinely think Amanda Ribas at this stage has the worst chin in women's MMA history, and if anyone can think of anyone who has a worse chin in women's MMA, past, present or future, than Amanda Ribas, I'd love to hear it, because I don't think there is one. So another reason that I'm a bit weirded out by Ribas is that she's gone from having her career best performance to her career worst performance when she beat Viviane Araújo in like an absolute beatdown, and then when she got absolutely beat down by Maycee Barber. I went back and looked into those fights a bit more, and I reread my analysis of the Araújo versus Ribas fight. It was a fight I was really looking forward to at the time, and I did quite a detailed write-up because I think that they're both fighters that I have had quite a good betting relationship with, and I feel like I really understand their styles, and I was certain it was going to be a very close pick'em fight that was going to end in a split decision or like at least a close 29-28 kind of thing. But yeah, Amanda Ribas absolutely smoked her, and it was so weird to me that I literally just chalked it up to like an anomaly, and I still continued to bet Viviane Araújo. I bet her in her last fight against Jennifer Maia and won as like a plus 170 underdog, which was lovely. But based off what we saw in that fight compared to the fight against Ribas, I am simply chalking it up to just some sort of weird external factor that caused Vivi to have an underperforming fight there. So if you do put an asterisk on that one, and then you compare that Ribas's last fight was against Maycee Barber, where she got absolutely pulverized. I also bet Barber by KO or decision in that fight as well, simply because I didn't trust Ribas's chin then. I just don't think you can have her as a minus 300 or greater, I think, in some books. I don't think you can have her as that price tag in like a top 15 UFC level fight. So she's facing Luana Pinheiro, who won her Dana White's Contender Series fight via a KO and also scored a knockdown against Sam Hughes, which demonstrates to me that she has power. Demonstrates to me that she has enough power to test that chin of Amanda Ribas. So I think it's a really interesting narrative, and it's absolutely enough of a narrative for me to be spooked off of betting Ribas at this price tag. The reason I think she's at this price tag is because I do think she is a superior martial artist, and that if this fight goes 3 rounds, she really should win. But I think a lot of it, what's baked into the line, is also just the public perception of Pinheiro. Her stock is just really low because because that last fight against Waterson Gomez, she lost that fight, let's be totally honest. She lost against an old veteran that no one really thinks is any good anymore, Waterson Gomez. I mean, look what happened to her in her last fight. She got one of the worst women's beatdowns we've ever seen against Marina Rodriguez. Before that robbery, which obviously wasn't her fault, she's not a judge, she faked an injury against Randa Marcos to get Randa Marcos disqualified, which probably was her fault. The public are pretty raging at Pinheiro. No one likes her. And I think that when you consider that not everyone looks at fights and betting lines in the detail that you or I do, there will be some people who would just want to fade her because they pissed off at her for the way that she's handled her UFC career so far, which is something we're not going to do because that's not how betting works, and you shouldn't bet emotionally. You should always bet objectively in these situations and take your feelings and opinions of a fighter out of the equation. And so when I do that, despite the fact that I really like Amanda Ribas, I can tell you for a fact that minus 300 or greater is a wide line. She deserves to be the favourite because she is the better fighter, and to trust a women's MMA fighter to get a finish is not a smart idea. But I therefore think that the price that you're going to get on Luana Pinheiro to win by KO is going to be pretty high, and it's one I'm definitely looking at. If I can get plus 600 or better on Pinheiro to win by knockout, I just think that Luana Pinheiro and every opponent that Amanda Ribas faces in the future is going to have a decent enough chance to knock her out if they have shown any form of power in the past, which Pinheiro absolutely has done. So if I get a decent line, I'll be happy to bet that. I'm not really keen on betting on the money line because I do expect the fight to go the distance, and if the fight does go the distance, Amanda Ribas really should win it. So I don't necessarily think there's enough meat on the bone for an underdog play there on Pinheiro's money line, but there will probably be a decent price on the TKO KO line, and I will be looking to take that for half a unit if I can get, I'll say plus 500 or more, but we'll see. Our next fight is a really scrappy kickboxing fight between Uros Medic and Jonny Parsons. Full disclosure, I bet against both of these guys in their last bouts, and I lost both of those bets. I tried to fade Uros Medic against Matthew Semmelsberger, and after a pretty shaky start, he turned the tide and absolutely blitzed on Semmelsberger in the latter half of that fight. And I tried to bet against Jonny Parsons against the hometown Danny Roberts, which was looking quite good when he won the first round, but eventually Jonny Parsons turned up the heat and scored a few knockdowns and then actually finished Danny Roberts, which is really how his path to victory was supposed to look there. So it's never a good starting point when you see two names that you've lost bets against. It's never a good starting point when you're trying to break down a fight like that because there's a lot of ego involved in betting and it can very easily poison your opinion of a fighter. So if I have tried to bet against these guys and I've lost money on it, it's very easy for your brain to go, well, these guys must be so much better than you thought they were because they made you lose a bet. It's very hard to silence that voice in your head when that's happened. And also it kind of does make you really question your read and your overall opinion of them because you were wrong the first time. So, maybe you'll just continue to be wrong and you have to completely recalibrate that opinion. So for that reason, I knew I wasn't going to be super invested in looking at this fight from a betting perspective. And also when you consider that it's going to be a pure striking fight between guys who on paper seem to have a very similar-ish kind of style and game plan, it's not the kind of fight that necessarily appeals to me, as I said earlier on, when you're looking at the Jordan Leavitt versus Chase Hooper fight. Obviously, I noticed that the betting line is actually not particularly close between them, with Medic currently sitting as a minus 250 favourite, and there are a few reasons for this, which I do kind of understand. Firstly, Medic just has a better record at this stage. He's more proven. He went 15 minutes with an established striker like Matthew Semmelsberger and also Omar Morales, whilst Parsons has squeaked past the underwhelming Solomon Renfro, who isn't really good enough to consistently fight for any major organisation. And he also dropped that first round against Danny Roberts, which kind of implies that his winning ability is more predicated on him scoring knockdowns and finishes as opposed to it actually being about him having that minute-by-minute process-driven approach, which is something I always favour over a harder hitter. Simply put, I just think that Medic can probably do everything that Parsons can do, but he just might be able to do them all a little bit better. At the very least, he has a pretty significant size advantage, which will probably play a key factor in terms of overall power and distance management. Not that he has a massively long reach, but he is quite tall in comparison to Jonny Parsons. I think he also just has the higher ceiling based off the level of competition that he's beat and the fact that I've never really been impressed with Jonny Parsons. Yeah, there's always a puncher's chance, but the line does seem a little bit wide for that reason, because you have to give credit to the fact that a hard hitter like Jonny Parsons can absolutely find the target in potentially a 15-minute striking affair. But overall, I think Medic has proven himself worthy of being the favourite here. I wouldn't line it anywhere near as wide as it is at minus 250, but minus 200 probably sounds about right to me. Therefore, I don't see any value on the betting line. And as I said, I wasn't really particularly interested in betting this fight anyway, so it's an easy pass for me. And finally, we get to the fight that I am most excited about on this card, and that is Jonathan Pearce versus Joanderson Brito. If you've been following me on Reddit, you may have seen that this was the first bet I placed on the card, and I placed 5 units on Jonathan Pearce in a fight that I'm very confident in. Honestly, I'm absolutely baffled by this betting line. I remember seeing it open on BetOnline in the US like a week or two ago, and I saw that Jonathan Pearce was around minus 160, and I didn't even really react because I was like, that is so badly priced that there's no way that price actually holds by the time it gets to the UK, which is like a week later. So we don't get openers like that, so we never really get to profit on that side of things. But for some reason, the line has stayed the same, and in some spots in the UK, you can actually get minus 150, which is what I got. I just think that Jonathan Pearce is a top 15 talent who's fighting non-top 15 talent opposition at the moment, and until people realise that he is destined for bigger things, I'm going to continue to bet on him. He's got the archetype of my absolute favourite fighter to bet on, and that is someone who is well-rounded and has cardio that is good enough to weaponise. So think Billy Quarantillo and Bill Algeo. They're two guys who, if they survive the first round against you and they deal with you at your like freshest, they're going to cook you, and they will cook you to the bone, and they will just rinse you for 15 minutes. And that is exactly what I expect to happen here. Jonathan Pearce, right? He got off to a terrible start in the UFC with a shot loss to Joe Lozon in his debut. But, you know, when it's your debut, you're fighting a guy who's really experienced. These kind of things can happen. Look at Sergey Pavlovich. The same thing happened to him. But since then, he's gone on to beat Kai Kamaka, who is impressing over at Bellator. Omar Morales, who is, despite probably not being in the UFC anymore, a decent striker. Christian Rodriguez, who looks destined for the top 10 at flyweight. I know Christian Rodriguez was fighting upper weight class, but still. Makwan Amirkhani, who is a tricky grappling threat, but also is a gift of a matchup for Jonathan Pearce. And finally, Darren Elkins, who has shown that he's still got enough left in the tank to grapple you to death if you're not a good enough grappler. I think that all of those wins have definitely made up for that shock loss to Joe Lozon, and I think it's kind of demonstrated it was just a fluke, and we can forgive him for that. Also, in terms of looking at his record, Pearce was supposed to be fighting Bryce Mitchell recently. That was his last booked fight, which Mitchell fell out of because of injury. That's a testament to where he's actually at in his career and where he's supposed to be going. Like, Bryce Mitchell looks like he's 2 more wins away from potentially having a title shot, and he was supposed to be fighting Jonathan Pearce in that fight. So we look over to the other side and we have Joanderson Brito, who really did look like an exciting addition to the UFC when he won on Dana White's Contender Series. I was really sold on him, and I thought it was a really exciting prospect and was really looking forward to his next fight. And his first fight in the UFC was against none other than Bill Algeo, who I mentioned is a very similar pressure cardio guy like Jonathan Pearce. And he did exactly that in that fight. Brito had a decent round 1, but once he sort of threw his best weapons and didn't have as much explosiveness anymore, Bill Algeo just turned the tides on him, just wrestled him and showed him what wrestling at the UFC level is like. Brito just had nothing for him in rounds 2 and 3, and it was a pretty serious wake-up call. When you look back to the moment he got signed on Dana White Contender Series, Dana White had a soundbite where he said something along the lines of he thinks Brito is like the most exciting Brazilian talent we've seen in years, which is hilarious, to be honest. But that probably holds a little bit of weight and probably makes people think that Brito is still going to come good and be really good. And in fairness, he is on a 3 fights winning streak, and he won all 3 fights in under 3 minutes. The first one was against Andre Fili. I respect that. Andre Fili can't really take a punch as well as he used to, and is in the latter half of his career, but it's still an impressive win. Then he beat Lucas Almeida, who has become incredibly overrated now in the UFC. I'll get more to that later, but Lucas Alexander slipped off a kick and then got choked out. That would have happened to anybody, really. And also he beat Weston Wilson. Who the hell is Weston Wilson? Honestly, I don't think that Joanderson Brito's 3-1 UFC record is impressive. I think that he's been massively overvalued because he's had wins against opposition that's not particularly impressive, in my opinion. So yeah, in terms of how this fight should actually play out, I think that Joanderson Brito is obviously very dangerous early. He's got decent-ish wrestling. He's got very clear knockout power, which Jonathan Pearce will obviously have to be very careful of. But Pearce has the same level of dangerousness late in the fight once he gets going, because he just charges up. He's not even a slow starter, really, but if he makes it to the stool and we get to see the second round, I think Jonathan Pearce is going to absolutely dog walk Joanderson Brito. in rounds 2 and 3. Pressure wrestlers are an absolute nightmare if you've tried to hit them with your best shot. And Brito has shown that he doesn't really have the cardio to keep up with that for 15 minutes because Bill Algeo drowned him. And if Bill Algeo can drown him, I think Jonathan Pearce absolutely can drown him, and I fully expect him to. So I've got 5 units on Jonathan Pearce at -150, and I feel very confident about it. I may even add a small sprinkle on Jonathan Pearce to win in rounds 2 or 3 because of that cardio narrative. It's a bet that I quite often like to employ in fights like this. So yeah, Jonathan Pearce all the way. I don't understand why this line is where it is, and I would hope to see it improve in the coming days because I just don't think it should be there at all. Also, in terms of live betting, I don't talk about this very often because I don't really do it very often because I live in the UK. Sometimes I don't stay up for the fights, but you should have a great opportunity to bet Jonathan Pearce live betting after round 1. If Brito has a good round 1, lands a few heavy shots and maybe wins it on the scorecards, but they get back to the stool, I think you can trust Jonathan Pearce to turn the tide of that fight. So you might get a better line than I've got here at -150. And in the next fight of the night, we have Chad Anheliger versus Jose Johnson. Chad Anheliger is a fighter who has honestly just never impressed me. I remember thinking when he got signed to the UFC off the back of a win over Muin Gafarov on Dana White's Contender Series that there was no way that he'd last in the organisation. But an absolute gift in his UFC debut by the name of Jesse Strader elongated his stay within the company because he started off with a win, which obviously means it'll take him longer to get cut. Since then, he's only fought once and he looked absolutely atrocious in getting pieced up by the limited but powerful striking of Anheliger. That's the same guy that got absolutely destroyed by Chris Gutierrez a couple of weeks ago. And I just don't think it'll be long before 1 or 2 more losses and Chad Anheliger gets kicked to the curb. He's 36 years old now. I just don't understand why the UFC firstly signed him and secondly gave him a layup in Jesse Strader. So he faces Jose Johnson here, and Jose Johnson has had a very weird showing in Dana White's Contender Series in his UFC performances so far in his career. He's a striker, quite obviously, but somehow he just can't stop grappling. It's always frustrating when you see the fighters like that. But we got to see a very short glimpse of his potential on the feet in the early goings of that Damon Blackshear fight. But typically, it didn't take long before it turned into a grappling fest. Obviously, that's what Damon Blackshear wants to do, and he hit him with a twister a couple of minutes later for crying out loud. So you can kind of forgive it, but it's just kind of frustrating when you see a fighter that just cannot seem to keep the fight where they want it, and Johnson doesn't seem really too capable to be able to do that. On the mat, he's not atrocious. He does have a few offensive tricks up his sleeve, especially in his guard. He has got really quick triangles and arm bars that he can throw up, and I saw him hit quite a few of those in like his last 3 or 4 fights. But he gives up his back every single time he attempts to get back to the feet, and honestly, I think any opponent has the potential to take his back if they grapple him just because he will give it to you. He doesn't therefore always succumb to the rear naked choke, so sometimes it is a bit of a viable method. I know, so, like, I always think back to Gerald Meerschaert lets his opponent take the mount because he's got a really good mount escape. But you're playing with fire. It's not a good thing you like to see very often, is it really? So Johnson's been submitted 4 times in his UFC career, in his MMA career, and that's really not surprising. He's also got a pretty close record of decision wins and losses, with 5 wins and 3 losses, which when you're somebody who gets grappled quite often, that's not surprising at all either. So I do have concerns over Jose Johnson's grappling. You have to obviously think about whether or not his opponent's going to be able to capitalize on it, and Chad Anheliger's a pretty bad grappler in his own right. His first layer of takedown defense, for example, is a guillotine choke. so that usually tells you all you need to know about someone's IQ in the grappling realm and their overall ability. And he's also been submitted 5 times himself. So I don't really know who to favour on the mat. I think Jose Johnson is the much bigger guy, so probably will have his own advantages on the mat. And I have actually seen some good things from Johnson on the mat, and I haven't seen anything I've really liked from Anheliger. So I suppose I lean towards Johnson in the grappling, but both men are strikers, so maybe I'm just talking for the sake of talking and that it won't actually go there. So yeah, I think the key talking point when we are talking about the striking affair is the absolutely massive size disadvantage on one man's side. So Johnson is 6 foot with a reach that's anywhere between 71 and 74 inches, depending on where you look at it. And Chad Anheliger is 5'6" with 64-inch T-Rex arms. Weight classes exist for a reason, so that automatically is going to give Anheliger a mountain to climb, just in terms of having to get past that reach. Jose Johnson does have the arsenal of a man who has a long reach. He'll use a lot of teep kicks, he uses a lot of straights, a lot of 1-2 combinations, which obviously, really maximizes that length as opposed to throwing a hook or some sort of spinning attack. In his defense, Chad Anheliger, with his T-Rex arms, does fight like a man who has T-Rex arms. He likes to get inside, he likes to throw combinations, he throws shots to the bodies, he throws shots to the head, and yeah, he very much likes to try and get into that dirty boxing range where he can do his best work, because he's not going to win a fight at distance. The problem is with him is that it doesn't take a whole lot to actually stifle that enthusiasm when you hit him with a few clean shots. That's exactly what Anheliger did. It took him a couple of minutes to actually really clock Anheliger, and then Anheliger went from being somebody who was going to fight at distance to somebody who was happy to sort of just coast along the side of the cage and just wait for his opponent to commit, and take the sort of footwork game out of the equation and make it a case of, if you want to fight me, you'll have to fight me against this wall, which will be at the range I want it to be at. So he waited for Anheliger to come to him, tried to slip a punch and throw something back, but overall he was just incredibly out-muscled and out-hustled by the superior striking and the superior power of the Mongolian that night. I just think that if he does that same thing against Jose Johnson, he's going to be in trouble, because Jose Johnson can keep him against the cage, but with that reach advantage, he can just stay out of range to the point where he can hit Anheliger, but Anheliger can't hit him back. So yeah, I don't really think that Chad Anheliger has any actual realm in which he has the advantage over Jose Johnson. Obviously, the grappling is a little bit of a unknown, and I didn't like a lot of what I saw from Jose Johnson just because of how much he was grappling in his last few fights, but he was fighting grappling-based opponents. And also, can you trust significantly undersized Chad Anheliger, who is not a grappler, to capitalize on that weakness? I don't think you can. So on the flip side, I think you're getting a really bettable price on Jose Johnson, who is 8 years younger, has a massive size advantage, and also has a big reach advantage and isn't outclassed anywhere. If Jose Johnson can fight a respectable fight, then he should be in the driver's seat here, more so than the 63% chance that the betting line is currently giving him. So I put 3 units on Jose Johnson at minus 175. To me, I think he should be a minus 250 favourite, which is 71%. So an 8% edge on the books. I was happy to take it. That's a 3-unit bet for me. I could kind of understand if someone didn't want to put 3 units on this fight, because it does seem quite low level. But I started off by saying I think Chad Anheliger is shit and he's not going to be around for very long. And I stand by that. And I think I'm putting my money where my mouth is. So yeah, entirely up to you whether or not you want to risk it. But I think Chad Anheliger is no good. And next up, we have a clash between two strikers as Cesar Almeida takes on Christian Leroy Duncan. Now, I know in the breakdown of the Tom Aspinall fight last week, I kind of went into a bit of detail about the fact that I am British and therefore I have quite a lot of opinions about British fighters that are usually positive. But that's not actually true, because really my entire betting game plan over the years has really been in fading British fighters. And there are a variety of reasons for that, but I just know that the UK media over here absolutely hypes up everybody and makes everybody from the UK seem like they're amazing, Paddy Pimblett being a great example. The main reason for it is that in this country, because we don't have a appreciation for any of the grappling arts, because it's not a part of our school curriculum or anything, what we do have in terms of the history of combat sports in this country is a deep heritage of boxing. Therefore, all MMA promotions in this country focus on pushing fighters who are flashy, who have style, who have a striking and fan-friendly style, as opposed to those who have process and a well-rounded skill set. So that is why fighters like Michael Venom Page have become such a big deal in this country compared to the likes of someone like, I don't know, Mike Grundy. I know Mike Grundy's obviously never achieved anything, but like he was probably one of the most credentialed MMA fighters that the UK's had in recent years, and no one gave a shit about him because he's just a wrestler. I think Christian Leroy Duncan kind of ties into that narrative as well, because he is all flash and no substance on the feet. Like, I don't think he understands how to win a round. I think all he wants to do is land like a highlight reel knockout and be the next MVP, which is not really a style that you'd ever want to bet on, is it, really? No, it's not what I would want to bet on. I just think that him and the general attitude of UK MMA is the reason why the UK has underperformed as a nation in MMA over the last 30 years. Like, 2 champions in 30 years is a pretty bad return, I would say, but maybe I'm being a bit harsh. So yeah, it's good that the UFC are at least investing in the circus that is Christian Leroy Duncan by giving him a fellow striker that's going to make for a fun fight, which once again leans into that compliment that I'm giving the matchmakers across this entire card. They've played him in a fight that's actually interesting. He fights Cesar Almeida here, who has just come off of a win on Dana White's Contender Series. You may have looked at his record and noticed that he is a 35-year-old with just a 4-0 record, but he comes from a kickboxing background and has a win over Alex Pereira, which the commentary team were very, very keen to tell us on Dana White's Contender Series. He also has 2 losses to Alex Pereira, but they didn't really mention that as much because that would get in the way of a good story, wouldn't it? It's definitely the right kind of opponent that Christian Leroy Duncan should be fighting, because it's in no one's best interest for either of these guys to attempt takedowns on each other or be taken down for that matter. Despite that, I do actually think that Cesar Almeida looked pretty good in terms of defending takedowns. He just had the right mentality towards get-ups and actual takedown defense, and his striking was quite composed and dialed in. It wasn't massively crazy and wild and winging shots and going for like crazy spinning techniques. It was very much quite meat and potatoes striking, but that is absolutely what you need. It does need to be said that the opponent that he was facing on the feet was pretty much a warm body. It took about a minute for you to realise that once he didn't have the physicality to get the fight to the floor, it was just going to be one-way traffic. But it was nice to see Almeida actually put in a composed performance in the face of a deer in the headlights of an opponent. Like, you would kind of forgive him for like trying to find some sort of wild knockout, especially on Contender Series where that kind of thing gets rewarded. But when you compare his like ability to use those straight shots and those fundamentals as opposed to Christian Leroy Duncan basically doing a ballerina routine in the cage, I think there's definitely a reason to like the underdog here. One of the big narratives that you'll probably hear a lot this week for this fight is that Christian Leroy Duncan has a 5-inch reach advantage in this fight, which, yes, that is true, but he also had an 8-inch reach advantage against Armen Petrosian in his last fight. That was enough for me to be spooked and stay away from betting in that fight. But if you watch it again, you'll see that Christian Leroy Duncan does not know how to use a reach advantage. 8 inches, and he was getting pieced up by straight shots and 1-2 combinations from Petrosian and body kicks, which basically is mainly a range-based output, despite having an 8-inch disadvantage. I'm happy to say that Christian Leroy Duncan is not going to use that 5-inch reach advantage, especially when he's got an opponent who is throwing a similar kind of output to what Armen Petrosian had. So yeah, there might not be a whole lot of a skill gap here in terms of like both men's actual striking prowess and ability, but I think there are advantages in Almeida's side in terms of the general process and the primary weapons that he uses. Christian Leroy Duncan to me is just happy to be a clown and is looking for like that highlight reel that's going to catapult him to become the next Joaquin Buckley. I just don't think that he actually has a whole lot outside of that, and he will continue to lose in those kind of fights if he faces a guy who doesn't get caught by what he's trying to throw. So as long as Almeida sticks behind a 1-2 combination, throws some rangefinders, throws some teep kicks, throws some leg kicks and body kicks, a couple of head kicks, just your primary skill set, and stays away from getting involved in a spinning affair with Christian Leroy Duncan, I think that there's no way you can really justify him being the underdog. Duncan's style's not even going to win over the judges unless he actually hurts him, because he's going to be kicking thin air half the time and just showboating, whereas the other guy is going to be landing more volume. I'm aware that it is also a debut, and I always say I don't really like betting fighters that have come off the Contender Series, but at plus 110, when he's the underdog to someone who I think is as low level as Christian Leroy Duncan is, I'm happy to take a stab. It's only going to be a 1-unit stab, and I haven't actually bet it yet, but anything that is plus 110 or better I will be interested in. I don't know if the money's going to go on Almeida's side or against him, so I might wait to see if I can get a better price, but I will definitely have 1 unit at least plus 110 on Cesar Almeida by fight night, because I think he should be a slight favourite simply based off of the tools that he has shown to use in that Contender Series fight versus the tools that Duncan was using in his last fight. Simple as that, really. Which leads us on to a heavyweight fight between Mick Parkin and Caio Machado. I spoke earlier on in this podcast about how I have a bias against UK fighters and I'm often trying to fade them. I'll hold my hands up and say I think I went a little bit too hard on that narrative in trying to fade Mick Parkin in his UFC debut at UFC London against Jamal Pogues. In my defence, I think that here, the tape that we saw on the regional scene and also the tape we saw from Dana White's Contender Series, he looked like a completely different fighter. Honestly, I was confused as to if I was even looking at the same guy. He looked composed, he looked intelligent, his shot selection was really on point, and he just managed the fight against Jamal Pogues really well, which is interesting as well because Jamal Pogues has been one of the more effective point-based fighters at light heavyweight that I've seen at the lower levels, so to see Mick Parkin actually beat him at his own game was genuinely quite impressive. So yeah, Mick Parkin also trains with Tom Aspinall, which is another reason to be intrigued by him. Obviously I'm recording this before the UFC 295 main event, so I could be talking about our new heavyweight champion, or I could just be talking about some guy in the top 5. But yeah, Mick Parkin, there's stuff to be intrigued about. I'm kind of keen to see what happens in this fight and where his ceiling actually is. He faces Caio Machado here, who I thought fought a pretty lackluster fight on Dana White's Contender Series, and if Dana wasn't trying to sign every single regional talent possible to change the business model of the UFC, he absolutely wouldn't have signed Caio Machado. The guy's regional record is appalling. He's crushed cans on the Canadian regional scene for an organisation called BFL, which isn't even the best Canadian regional promotion, despite the fact that the Canada regional scenes is like a known joke in like the MMA world. Yeah, I just don't think there was anything from Machado that was intriguing or promising or particularly like eye-opening that I think will either A, give Mick Parkin serious troubles, or secondly be a redeeming feature in its own right. I don't understand why Caio Machado is in the UFC, and I don't expect him to be in the UFC very long, I don't think. We go back to the betting line as we always do, and we see Mick Parkin is minus 350 here. I always preach caution on these guys who aren't necessarily proven, but would you really want to play minus 350 on a guy who has historically looked awful? I know he looked better in his last fight, but before that looked pretty awful, especially also considering that this is heavyweight MMA, which is, in my opinion, the highest variance division in the entire UFC. Higher variance than any women's division, simply because you've got guys who don't have the cardio for 15 minutes, so like all game plans and all logic falls out the window after 5 usually, and also within the first 5 minutes a lot of them have fight-ending power, so any fighter can get knocked out. I don't like betting on heavyweight MMA for that reason, especially in a low level like this, and especially when one guy is minus 350. I think it's a very easy pass because I don't think Machado has enough of a credible reason for me to bet him. Just pass on the fight yet again. Next up, we have the second women's MMA fight on the card between Luci Pudilova and Ailin Perez. I will keep this one really short and sweet. Luci Pudilova is a decent striker but a bad grappler, and Ailin Perez is a decent grappler but a bad striker. However, I have absolutely no idea which fighter is going to be the one to assert their dominance, so I don't know. It's a low-level fight. It's not really the kind of fight I'd ever really want to put my money on. Ailin Perez is absolutely shocking on the feet that I could never stomach the idea of having money on her to win a fight. In terms of my general notes for this one before we move on, in case you are interested, it's interesting to me that Ailin Perez is training with Gillian Robertson over at Goat Shed, because having one of the most prolific grappling-based finishers in women's MMA training with you every single day must be good, because if Ailin Perez is landing takedowns, being able to do something with them in terms of fight-ending ability is going to be great for her going forward, because she's got a lot of enthusiasm and general like wrestling competence, but without having the finishing equity to back that up, it kind of does make her quite limited. And yeah, I think Gillian Robertson should be able to help her with that. So yeah, I think I probably lean towards Perez as a slight favourite, just because Pudilova's looked pretty bad at defending takedowns in her life and Perez is tough and scrappy, but I really don't care, so I'm just going to move on. Don't bet the fight. And next up, we have a pretty low-level affair between Nikolas Motta and Trey Ogden. To me, Trey Ogden is one of those slippery fighters that doesn't actually necessarily excel at any one area, but his main weapon is general enthusiasm and an ability to make his opponent work hard, which is a hard thing to quantify, but I do think it's quite apparent when you watch his fights. I honestly do not know how your UFC record can see you lose a split decision to Jordan Leavitt and then follow that up with a win against Daniel Zellhuber. I know MMA maths is a joke for reasons like that, but it just doesn't make any sense to me now. Also, to go one further, he was actually reasonably impressive in his loss to Ignacio Bahamondes. I had Bahamondes in a parlay that night and was really confident that he should have a clear striking advantage. But Trey Ogden kept it reasonably competitive to the point where plus 275 was a bit of a misprice, and I genuinely came away from it thinking that my bet on Bahamondes had absolutely no value at all. On the other hand, you've got Nikolas Motta, who I think has been really underwhelming in the UFC so far. He came in as a sort of violence-based, hard-hitting KO artist, and whilst he has delivered on that with KO losses and wins throughout his whole career, he's actually just an awkward counter-striker that sometimes is waiting for that perfect moment to land the counter shot, that he becomes quite hesitant and fails to push the action. So very easily you can see that he often lets fights get away from him just because he gets so far behind on the strike metrics that he gives himself a mountain to climb if he's not going to win by KO. When you compare that to what I was saying about Trey Ogden having that busyness and just general enthusiasm, that therefore makes this fight quite intriguing. It's a pretty low level fight, I know, but I honestly do think that Ogden's lack of KO losses in his career and his general busyness is enough to make him at least a pick'em here, if not a slight favourite in my opinion. I just think that whenever you're looking at a fighter who you don't think is very good and you're looking to fade them, you have to remember who's swinging the hammer. It's a phrase that I say quite a lot. And I think that Nikolas Motta is absolutely a fighter that should not be trusted to deliver a KO, mainly because of the way that he tries to set up his KO shots. The way that he caught Cameron Van Camp was an example of him doing it well, but he still was patient, methodical, and did not throw enough strikes. He did not go out there with a man looking to separate his opponent from his consciousness. He looked like a man who was going to hope to get lucky in throwing the right punch at the right time. And that's not always going to work, especially a guy like Trey Ogden who's never been KO'd. You have to assume that more often than not, the fight's going to go a bit longer. And the longer that fight goes, the more I think Ogden is going to just get in his face and just piece him up with these little shots that aren't actually going to do a whole lot of damage to Motta, but are just going to be enough to throw off his timing and stop him from landing that one shot that he needs. Also, the potential to mix in takedowns on Ogden's side. We haven't really seen a whole lot of Nikolas Motta grappling, but he's probably a bit undersized in this fight, I think, if memory serves. So yeah, I just think that the general enthusiasm of Trey Ogden should be enough for him to disrupt this fight and therefore just make it a little bit more competitive than the plus 125 price tag he currently has demonstrates. I think he should be a slight favourite here. It's obviously, again, like I said, a low-level fight, so that's not the most confident pick I have in the world, but I'm happy to play a bit of money on it. So I'm currently looking at Trey Ogden at plus 125, and I will be playing it for 1 unit, but I am waiting to see if the line gets any better, because obviously in a spot like this, you want to get as much value as you can out of the line. There is also a chance that people are going to want to fade Trey Ogden because he's not really been very impressive, and Nikolas Motta is a striker primarily, so maybe we get a better price. If so, I'll be happy to jump on it, but watch this space. I'll definitely have a unit on him at plus 125 or better. Next up, we have another Johnson as Charles Johnson faces Rafael Estevam. I am quite surprised that Charles Johnson is still in the UFC, to be honest, because if we're being totally fair, his UFC record should be 1 win and 4 losses. That Zhalgas win for him was a robbery. One of the worst ones I think I've seen in recent years. He really did not deserve to win that fight at all. Also, I don't think he has anything near any sort of selling point. He's very much a decision-based fighter. He has that cocky style where he'd rather get a meme moment than actually like put in a comprehensive performance. He just doesn't have the actual ability to be able to fight like that. You know, he's not Kevin Holland. Yeah, I think I identified in his last couple of fights that he's absolutely untrustworthy. Like, similarly to Kevin Holland, I don't like backing him either. He's a fighter that he goes in there and he just does not show you that he wants to win the fight. So why would you want to put your money on someone like that? Because he's not going to impress the judges with that style either. I came to that conclusion, and then I bet against Charles Johnson with Cody Durden and as an underdog, and that panned out quite nicely for me. Honestly, in terms of Johnson's skill sets, I do actually think he's a competent fighter. Like, he's not bad at anything except his own attitude, if that makes sense. You just should not be looking to bet a fighter like that, especially when there's a minus next to his name on the betting line, because this fight is a pick'em against Rafael Estevam. Typically, like a lot of other fighters on Fight Night cards, there isn't a whole lot of information on Rafael Estevam. He won on Dana White's Contender Series, but he hasn't fought anyone else on the regional scene that makes the tape worth looking at. But because Charles Johnson was pick'em price, I thought that I had to look into this fight for one last opportunity to fade Johnson before he gets cut. So I did do a bit more of a deep dive than I usually do for a Dana White's Contender Series guy. It's quite obvious from watching Estevam's last 2 fights that he's a pretty competent grappler, and he looks like a pretty good one. His commitment to ground striking on that Dana White Contender Series win was quite refreshing. It's good to see a fighter who, if they can't quite get to the positions to set up their submissions, then just use your other form of offense, which is something I wish a lot more fighters would do. He was facing a pure Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy in that fight who was obviously going to be susceptible to getting hit on the ground because he was constantly trying to create angles for submissions instead of working back to his feet or trying to like reverse position and sweep. Again, I said this so many times on this podcast, but it's important not to overinflate how good a fighter looks on Dana White's Contender Series. Ask yourself how many other fighters could have put on that same performance that Estevam put on just then. So I went and looked at his LFA performance, which came before the Dana White's Contender Series win, and that's where we got to see a bit more of his striking, and that is where the weakness is, and that is why this fight is probably a pick'em. So Estevam's striking isn't bad, but his offense just consists of a teep kick and a massive overhand when he's at distance, because he wants to come crashing into boxing range so that he can either shoot his takedown or just wing hooks at boxing range. When he does wing hooks like that, his chin is kind of up in the air, it's exposed, and I did see him get wobbled right at the end of a round on the buzzer. But yeah, I think that from watching his striking, I was like, that is very wild, and anyone who is smart should be able to beat that. Yeah, so honestly, thinking about how that compares to Charles Johnson and his striking, I think that Charles Johnson could very easily manage distance. He has quite a rangy style. He doesn't have a massive reach advantage, but he will throw straight shots, and you know, he likes to do a whole lot of movement when he is striking. So I think that that's actually a pretty good stylistic opponent for him to look good on the feet. But then obviously it becomes a question of how does he deal with the takedown attempts. I'm not too sure, to be honest. I know Charles Johnson didn't look particularly good in the Cody Durden fight in terms of defending takedowns, but historically before that, I think he has actually looked okay in terms of his ability to stop people from wrestling him. So again, also not seen a whole lot of evidence of Estevam's wrestling, because most of it we saw Dana White's Contender Series was against a guy who wanted to grapple him as well. So we don't know how good Estevam's ability to get the fight to the floor is. But from what we do know, I think Charles Johnson probably should win this fight, but the only person who's going to beat him is himself. Like I said in the opening paragraph, I think he's not trustworthy to do what needs to be done, and it wouldn't surprise me if he lets this fight run closer and he lets Estevam actually have striking success, despite the fact that Johnson's clearly the superior striker, in my opinion. With it being a pick'em, surprisingly, I think the books have actually got it right, so I don't have a whole confident read on what number the price should actually be, just because there's no evidence of Estevam's wrestling ability, and that's what you need to know, because that's his primary path to victory. But yeah, Charles Johnson definitely has a chance to win this, a decent chance, I would say, but I don't think you can trust him, so for that reason, it's a pass from me. And the first fight of the night is Lucas Alexander versus Jeka Saragih. Now, obviously, I am going to take a little bit of time to do a bit of a victory lap here, because I was one of the first people, and one of the only people, I think, to actually bet Lucas Alexander in that fight last time against Steven Peterson. Obviously, his debut didn't go according to plan against Joanderson Brito, but you watch that back, he tripped off a kick, and before he could get back to his feet, Brito had his back. Like, it was just a really bad luck situation that he kind of just fell into. I don't really take anything from that, to be honest, just bad luck. And yeah, on the regional scene, I was really impressed with how fluid his kicking game looks. It did remind me of Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, and I think it was just a real sight to behold at a regional level. I did see that he did have grappling deficiencies. I was aware of that, and I thought if he did lose the fight to Steven Peterson, that's how he would do it. But again, you have to remember who you're trusting to swing the hammer, and Steven Peterson is not good. So if there was any fighter that I would have backed to beat Steven Peterson, it would have been somebody who had the style of Lucas Alexander. So I had absolutely no problem in betting it at plus 150, I think it was. So yeah, I am equally aware though that bet was more often than not because of Peterson being shit, not because Alexander is a real life version of Neo from the Matrix. But for some reason, the bookies have taken the latter to be the truth. And we're now starting to see Lucas Alexander at prices like minus 250 against David Onama, and here at minus 300 or maybe slightly more against Jeka Saragih. As somebody who did do quite a deep tape study on him for that fight against Peterson, I think I have a right to say that he's not that good. I don't think he deserves to be minus 250 against Onama, and I was going to bet Onama in that fight before it got cancelled. I don't know if he deserves to be minus 300 against Jeka Saragih, but I don't think he deserves to be minus 300 against anyone who is UFC level. The question is Jeka Saragih UFC level? It's times like this where I think back to that fight Jack Della Maddalena had earlier in the year against that debuting regional guy Basil Hafez, who was 8-3. If you are one-dimensional and you can be grappled, it doesn't take a world beater to grapple you. You don't have to be Khabib to capitalize on it. And if that Basil Hafez guy could do it to Jack Della Maddalena, can Jeka Saragih do it to Lucas Alexander? I don't know. I'm not saying he does. I'm not saying he doesn't, because Jeka Saragih is, obviously not very good. And he came from the Road to UFC show, which I know I speak badly about Dana White's Contender Series, but I have less faith in the tape that you get from Road to UFC, because at least the guys coming into Contender Series are sometimes proven on US regional shows, whereas the Asia scene is kind of limited in that regard. I do think it's worth noting that I think the reason for this price being so wide is a weird byproduct of what happened between Ansel Jabli and Mike Breeden a couple of weeks ago. So obviously, if you've looked at the records, you'll see Ansel Jabli beat Jeka Saragih, and then Ansel Jabli went on to get beaten by Mike Breeden, who's awful and was on a really bad skid of losses. Simple MMA maths tells you that Jeka Saragih must be really bad, and I think that's probably the reason that Lucas Alexander is minus 300. I imagine Lucas Alexander probably deserves to be favourite because he probably is the better striker. I do like what I see from his striking, but you can't be one-dimensional at this level. Jury's still out on whether or not Jeka Saragih is that level, but I don't think I want to find out the hard way with my money. So, for the love of God, I don't think you should be parlaying minus 300 Lucas Alexander against anyone. So, don't, basically. That's all I'm going to say on that one. So there we have it. There is the full card breakdown for UFC Vegas 82. Just before we get going, a quick recap of all the bets that I've mentioned. I have 3 units on Brendan Allen to win at minus 137. This was obviously parlayed with Ricci versus Godinez to last over 2.5 rounds, which it did. I also have 5 units on Michael Morales to win at minus 250. 5 units on Jonathan Pearce to win at minus 150. 3 units on Jose Johnson to win at -175, and 1 unit on Trey Ogden to win at +125. I will also be betting the following in the coming days: 0.5 units on Luana Pinheiro to win by TKO KO at +500 or better, and 1 unit on Cesar Almeida at +110 or better. I will also be adding a 0.5 unit parlay of the following 4 fighters, which are my parlay pieces: Brendan Allen, Michael Morales, Jonathan Pearce, and Jose Johnson. And finally, my dog of the week is Trey Ogden. As always, keep an eye out for the Reddit post itself, which is in the comment section below. Obviously, I can't make changes to this audio once it's gone out, and I do go out quite early with my breakdowns, so there is the potential that I add more bets or change the unit staking of some of these bets. So keep an eye out to see when I place them and what prices I get those bets I've not yet placed. And finally, there will be a break after this week, so I'll be back on November 26th, the Sunday before the Dariush versus Sarukian card, with another podcast and another breakdown of all of those fights. I will catch you then.